This is Scott Loveridge with the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. Welcome. I'm your moderator today, and once our presentation gets going, I'll be monitoring the chat box here over at the left. If you've got questions for our presenter, just go ahead and enter those in the chat box, and I will make sure that he addresses them. Our topic today is, as you can see, rural education. And our speaker is Elton Mykerezi. He's an associate professor with the Department of Applied Economics and an extension economist with the Center for Community Vitality at the University of Minnesota. And his research focuses on the study of human capital and labor markets, the economics of poverty, food insecurity, and poor nutrition, rural businesses, and labor market development. His extension and outreach efforts aim to improve economic opportunities for a vulnerable population by focusing primarily on access to healthy foods, quality education, and opportunities for entrepreneurship and employment. Welcome, Elton.
Thank you, Scott. Hello, everyone. I first want to thank the NCR-CRD for the generous funding and for hosting this event. The overall idea of this project was to sort of conduct an overview of what we know about rural education, and then perhaps adding just some preliminary new data on where I thought that might be warranted. So we'll get started. So first of all, I'll talk about rural areas. What do I mean by rural? And then I'll provide a very brief overview of the literature on rural education, and I will omit lots of topics. So this is not by any means meant to be an all-inclusive review. And then we'll talk about conceptual links between rurality and education research. So I think one of my main theses here, and in a policy report that I'm writing to submit to the center, is that there's a lot of education research out there, and I think there really needs to be a systematic way of examining how rural areas sort of fare into the general sort of study of education in several disciplines. So then we'll focus on teacher labor markets and on recent human resource reform relating to teachers, and then a few developments in the political economy of school finance. Mostly local funding, and what do we know about that, and what's new. So in my mind, rural areas are sort of predominantly defined by two characteristics: population density and distance from other areas with a substantial density. So because of these two, there are many features that are predominantly found or disproportionately found in rural areas, but they're not necessarily unique to them, such as implications for taking advantage of economies of scale. The local politics of school funding tend to look a little different. Labor markets are thinner. There are fewer, there's a lower concentration of highly qualified people. There are lower returns to education in general. There could be lower income and higher poverty. This next point is related to the economies of scale, but there are general issues with providing public goods and services, because those do tend to require some scale. And also the private sector sort of equivalent of market diversity as an amenity. So what I mean here is you cannot have say Afghan restaurants and professional sports and the like, but also social capital and quality of life tends to differ, and so I will discuss how each of these things sort of fits into a very general framework for studying issues in education, in particular issues with teacher labor markets, and school finance. So distance from other population centers means reduced direct competition in education. And so this sort of has immediate implications for some of the tools that have been widely discussed in the past as solutions to educational problems, like open enrollment, for example. So Minnesota has an open enrollment policy where the state funding follows the student, and students can enroll into any district. So this was meant to increase competition so that districts do better. So this may work in dense areas, but if you have a sort of a local monopoly and the next school is 30, 40 miles away, then open enrollment will probably not matter very much. Also, there's been quite a bit of discussion on rural charters. So the same idea applies here. So some rural charters may work, but it is probably not reasonable to expect that rural charters are going to provide a long-term solution, because charters are built as means of specializing in niche markets like sort of ethnic or language immersion, or for creating unique experiments, like some schools will pay teachers differently, some schools will adopt curricula, and so in an environment where economies of scale are difficult to achieve, adding schools is likely to not provide a long-term solution. There's also difficulties in collaboration, so districts cannot share overhead and resources and administrative resources, perhaps facilities, as easily as they can in more dense areas. And there is a sparse private sector which could have both advantages and disadvantages for rural schools, and we'll get into that in a bit. So there's plenty of data out there on the percentage of adults with degrees, right? And so historically, there have been a higher share of adults in rural areas that did not complete high school, and a lower share of adults who completed college or better. And so on panel A, there's the high school completion gap, and in panel B, you can see the college gap. The high school completion gap has narrowed. The gap in the share of adults with a college degree has systematically widened. So when you see numbers like this, it is natural to ask, why is this? What is going on? So because these are adults, this is census data from the American Community Survey. So these are adults who live in metro and non-metro counties. So essentially, this could be anywhere from lower performing kindergartens and elementary schools all the way to high schools. It could be differences in propensities to go to college, so it could be a production problem with human capital, or it could also be predominantly disproportionate migration of more educated adults. So this sort of broad question of, are there differences between rural and urban schools, has been a fairly popular one. And after many, many studies, there has been no consensus on whether or not rural and urban schools differ in terms of achievement and how. And so I think that the reason for that is that it is really deep. Most people will try to analyze reasons why schools are different, and so they'll try to control for the different conditions in rural versus urban areas. And so the issue with that is that I think that why is a very demanding question to go after. It requires excellent data, longitudinal, that could sort of track progress across different conditions. So instead, some recent work that I did with some colleagues at the University of Georgia ran a very simple model and tried to really isolate when, if there are outcomes, when do they start. So we used a national cohort from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth of '97. So this is nationally representative, and people are first interviewed when they're at some point between 12 and 18 years old, and then they're followed into adulthood. It's also another convenient feature of this is that everyone takes the same very popular or very well tested achievement test on the second year of the interview. This is convenient because when they take it, some people have barely started high school and some people are ready to finish. And because they're just randomly assigned into cohort, it's almost like an experiment. You basically observe people coming in and at the end of high school, and you could try to see where these gaps are. So ultimately, we found that some achievement gaps appear very early. They pretty much remain the same during high school. We found no differences in rural versus in sort of growth during high school. We found no differences in the propensity to take a college entrance exam or on the scores for these college entrance exams. So there was a difference in scores, but it was fully explained by the earlier gap that arose before high school. But despite these sort of pre-college attributes being very similar, college enrollment was much lower, even lower than would be predicted by this achievement gap. And migration also was heavily responsible for adult education gaps. So something like this that sort of takes a very broad view can help us focus on what to study next. So, for instance, it appears that high schools are sort of performing at the same level. So it's probably one is probably not likely to find any sort of huge differences in or there's no sort of huge benefits to reap from studying high schools. There might be more benefit to looking into early childhood than perhaps the college transition. So that's about all I'm going to say about this sort of overall studies. Yep.
Elton, in my travels, I've often heard parents saying that if we send our kids to college, we'll lose them. Do you think that might have something, just an attitude issue?
So we are working on a paper that is trying to sort of look at the migration patterns and what predicts them. So yes, it is true that college-educated adults are less likely to live in their county of origin. That is true not only for rural areas. That's essentially true for everyone. College-educated adults are more mobile, regardless of where they're from. And so a lot of these movements, because basically they are more specialized and they have a wider job search span. So yes, if the parents are concerned about that, then they are right to be concerned about that. But that is not a uniquely rural problem. If you send your kids to college, odds are they could get jobs in South Africa. So there are sort of conjectures out there that actually tie investments in even lower education. So the idea is that communities have a limited incentive to invest in their educational system if all they're doing is they're creating these great schools who will produce these bright kids who will go to college and then will disappear. And so there is that sort of a dynamic public argument, which, to my knowledge, has not been sort of tested properly. And so I don't know if there is any empirical evidence on that. So, Scott, does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. Becky had a question too in terms of how does migration impact the adult education gap?
It widens it.
Or
It is responsible for a little over a third of it. Well, actually, for I think almost half of it. So college-educated adults are more likely to move from rural to urban areas, and people with only high school degrees are more likely to do the opposite. Okay. Shall we move on to? Okay. So one of the main areas where rural and urban areas might differ is the market for teachers, and this is very important because teachers are the most important school-based resource. So the effect that teachers have on the success of students is only rivaled by the effect of their parents, and absolutely nothing else. Not school funding. So teacher effectiveness is sort of the number one predictor of student success. So there is some literature out there on rural teachers and teacher labor markets, and so mostly studies will compare rural to urban teachers in terms of various aspects. So things like credentials, pay, attitudes towards the job, professional development, etc. So we know that rural teachers are less likely to hold a master's degree or better, more likely to have a bachelor's in teaching other than in the subject matter like mathematics or biology or geography. They are less likely to be licensed for the subject that they are teaching, although this is not entirely a reflection of their licensing. It is also a reflection of the fact that rural teachers tend to teach more subjects than urban teachers, so they would require multiple licenses to fulfill all of their obligations. They have fewer professional development opportunities. They do have similar tenure profiles, so they do not exit the labor force any sooner than urban teachers. They are more, on the other hand, they are more likely to report high job satisfaction. They are less likely to report issues with discipline and other non-pecuniary, other non-wage aspects of the job. So these non-wage aspects of the job are very important. They are more important in education than in probably any other labor market that I know of, and so we'll get into that in a minute. So the gap that I found on this literature is that it does a great job of comparing the characteristics of urban and rural teachers, but it has very little context. And so by context, I mean, for instance, there's a wide literature out there that analyzes occupational choice. And so people face different occupations and they make choices based on expected wages, expected non-wage benefits, on how much education one needs. And it's sort of a cost-benefit analysis whereby people narrow down certain occupations and then they go for one. And they could also sort of discover whether they were right about their expectations and switch occupations later on in their career. And so this process has been thoroughly analyzed, especially lately in the context of teachers. So in terms of, and so you would expect things like salaries, you would expect things like local amenities, things like salaries in the private sector, everything that would enter a person's decision to sort of weigh in on this. And I found very little in terms of systematic analysis of how do uniquely rural effects or how do uniquely rural or predominantly rural characteristics do in terms of attracting teachers. I found one paper by Miller in 2012 that used administrative data from New York to do something similar, something of a sort of a broad analysis of occupational choice. I also found little to no context on teacher labor markets in general, and too much focus on signals like degrees, certificates, licenses, professional development, etc. So the problem with having too little context on teacher labor markets in general, as we will see in the next couple of slides, is that teacher labor markets are very unusual everywhere, and it's because they're very unusual that some of these recruiting problems might be inherent in the occupation itself rather than rurality, and it would be hard to understand this by just sort of looking at comparisons between urban and rural teachers. There's also, there's too much focus on signals like degrees, certificates, licenses, professional development. and I say that because in recent years, mostly I'll say last 10 to 15 years, there has been an overwhelming increase in analysis of teacher quality with output data, so data on student test scores, data on student surveys or on peer evaluations. And the research has found that none of these signals, or what we call signals, so basically something that indicates, a signal is something that indicates qualifications, so a diploma or a master's or certain license, or having completed a module of professional development somewhere. So none of these predict output-based teacher quality. And so even though signals generally seem to be inferior in rural areas, that does not necessarily mean that teacher quality is lower. And so there needs to be sort of a wave of exploring how rural teachers fare in terms of output-based measures, in part because they are predictive of future success, and to a large extent because they are going to be the new measuring stick for teacher success in state and federal policy. And so they are increasingly coming into play in education policy. So what about teacher labor markets makes them so unique? So teacher pay is almost entirely determined by education and experience in teaching. So they have sort of like an Excel spreadsheet that says bachelor's year 1, 30,000, bachelor's year 2, 31,000, and so it's a steps and lanes salary schedule basically. Teachers are also overwhelmingly dismissed based on seniority only. So many states have, especially in unionized areas, have this last in first out rule. Now, even in areas that do not have an explicit last in first out rule, seniority ends up being the determining factor because both institutions and academics know remarkably little about how to predict who is going to end up being a high quality teacher. So essentially you can take applications and resumes and interview data and then put that up against these on-the-job performance measures in years 1, 2, and 3. The data that you observe prior to hiring teachers is not very predictive of how teachers are going to end up performing. So selecting good teachers before you watch them work for a year or two is a very difficult job. Essentially, there are no organizations that have shown to be able to do it effectively. The only one is Teach for America. So Teach for America has implemented a special module for evaluating teachers up front, and that has been shown to predict measured teacher success on the job. But also Teach for America is a little bit of an unusual teacher market because these are mostly altruistic Ivy League kids who will go into teaching for sort of personal reasons. They're not your average teacher.
Becky had a question here about relationships over signals. I think that's in terms of predicting. It's probably related to your last slide. And similar to that, her question sort of triggered a comment I've heard a few times in working in rural areas, that the hiring practices tend to favor very strongly locals. So, if the kid was born and raised in the county, they're going to get hired over somebody who's maybe better qualified, who's applying from outside. So maybe a couple things there for you to think about.
So the thing is that I would generally take issue with place of birth being a determining factor on employment, but hiring teachers is such a coin toss that it really doesn't matter. So, Teach for America has had a little bit of success of predicting who is going to perform well. And then there are two sort of large ongoing projects that are trying to predict future teacher success with pre-market data. One is in Spokane, Washington, and so I think they're having a little bit of success. The other one is here in the Twin Cities, and I'm one of the PIs on the project, and so we're still early on. We're hoping to have success, but we still have no results. And so when you say somebody who might be better qualified, right? We really don't know what that is. Because most teachers will have.
And
Yeah.
Becky's clarified. She's talking about relationships with the students, so kind of their ability to relate to the students, I guess, as a predictor of performance.
So from here on forwards, in sort of keeping with the literature, by performance I will mean something very specific, which is measured through three different things. One is student surveys, another one is peer reviews in classroom observations by peers, and another one is a statistical measure that uses standardized test scores to evaluate teachers, right? And different schools and different states and sort of different settings are combining these to generate a single measure of teacher performance. So signals like degrees and the like do absolutely nothing to predict which future teacher will have higher performance measured as such. So because of this, then other factors that are typically used in other markets sort of never come to play. Also, teaching is also sort of a naturally compressed career path. So if you think of a standard private sector career, one can start as a junior engineer and then become an associate engineer and then a senior engineer and then a supervising engineer, then a director, then a manager. So there's lots of specialization within the occupation, and people change what they do every few years. In teaching, that's not the case. You could be a math teacher for 30 years. So that also sort of has some implications. So what are the implications? So if you look at this, if you look at this chart, these are lifetime earnings taken from the American Community Survey. So essentially, based on people's ages, the average earnings over an average career have been discounted to a single number. So on the bottom axis here, we have the majors, and then the different colors here are the occupations, right? So this last bar here means that education majors will make about 1.8 million if they work in education. This tall bar here means that engineering majors will make about 4.1 million in their careers if they work in management, right? So the thing to notice about education, which is this last bar here on every major, is that regardless of major, it'll pay something like 1.8 million. And so now I'm choosing management as the comparison group because just like education, which requires different backgrounds, mathematics, biology, etc., management sort of does the same. A good manager, depending on what industry you're on, needs to have some technical knowledge over what they're managing, plus sort of general know-how. So now management will pay 4.1 million for an engineering major, and then something like 2 million for someone in psychology or literature, and or sort of 2.5 here, and then a little over 2 for education management. So essentially, management will pay twice as much for people with strong applied quantitative skills, like engineers, than for somebody with a degree in psychology. Education is trying to, or schools are trying to pay the same low amount for both, for art majors and engineering majors. And so clearly they're going to have a much easier time recruiting art majors than they are recruiting engineering majors, because engineering majors, you have to pull them away from about 4 million in lifetime earnings to about 1.8 or 1.9. So what this does is this creates imbalances in so let me move on to the next thing here. So this wage compression in education makes it so that individuals with more productive, and by productive here I mean stuff that pays in the private sector, with more productive skills in the private sector, or desirable credentials, are more difficult to recruit and a lot easier to lose. So there's an oversupply of science, technology, and engineering and math teachers, teachers in foreign languages, and special education. These are usually in short supply. And then there's an oversupply of general education teachers and majors in humanities and some social sciences. So hiring certain kinds of teachers is a problem everywhere. Now, being in a rural area could make it worse in some ways, and it could make it better in other ways, and we'll discuss some of those things in a bit. Now, another idea is that this wage compression makes it impossible for bidding on a single individual teacher, and so we'll talk about that some in a minute too. And also, since you can't pay people who you want to keep or attract more, since you can't pay them more money, then non-wage attributes become more important than in any other industry that I know of. And so accordingly, if you look at what happens in terms of when do teachers exit the occupation, so here I've plotted all Minnesota teachers and then art, languages, and humanities. So these tend to overlap. There's some exodus within the first 2-3 years, which is very common in education. And then it sort of settles down into mid-career, and then there's retirement age. So this is what a typical exit path looks for sort of the average teacher. Now, this one here is almost true by definition. So these are administrators, and obviously they do not exit early. They stay late just because you have to persist in the school system to become an administrator, right? So this is just for sort of illustrating the extreme. There's no sort of super revealing knowledge here, and so how that compares to the average teacher, right? So there's no mass exodus up front, and most people sort of retire somewhere between mid-career, or exit teaching somewhere between mid-career and retirement age. Now, this is elementary versus math, science, and technology, right? So math, science, and technology teachers have a much higher propensity to leave early, and far fewer make it all the way to retirement age. The opposite is true for general education teachers. And so one would now have a very hard time predicting this given those wage differentials. The same here for, what do I have there? Foreign languages? Oh no, these are foreign languages. And then here we have, let me see, administrators. So I use that as an example. So essentially, people with very marketable skills exit early, and people who only have education degrees and are into general education, they exit much later. They're far more likely to persist. So let me see here. So what's the implication for rural schools? All schools will have to compete for undersupplied specializations. Now, rural areas have fewer college-educated adults, so that makes it more difficult because finding somebody for a job is essentially a matching problem, and matching problems are harder to solve in thin markets. So if you don't have a lot of candidates, then finding the right match becomes more difficult. Now, low returns to education in the private market could be an advantage because one does not have to compete with Google for engineers, and so education jobs could be competitive relative to private sector jobs in rural areas, even for undersupplied areas. Also, the relatively low skill economies provide fewer other jobs, so it's not just a matter of pay, it's also a matter of finding the right job. So you have fewer candidates, but they also have fewer options. And the lower cost of living might also likely present some advantages.
What about the lack of discipline problems in the rural areas?
So
It seems
that's
like that
under
would
the
be
the
also-
non-wage competition, which is in this next slide here.
Okay.
So this marginal recruit problem, right? So everyone talks about rural schools paying less money on average relative to urban schools, and that makes it difficult to recruit, which is true. Paying less money on average does make it more difficult, but there is something useful here that rural schools can use to their advantage. No one has the ability to get into a bidding war over the next candidate. So suppose there's someone who is sort of considering a suburban and a non-metropolitan district, and they're just sort of considering the wage differences and also the differences in non-wage attributes like the lifestyle that they would have, and maybe even spousal opportunities, and so everything that could matter to a person other than money. Well, none of the schools has the ability to offer this individual more money in order to recruit them. If they wanted to offer this person more money, they would have to elevate the entire schedule, the entire salary schedule. So this inability to sort of directly recruit might favor rural areas because in direct bidding wars for really good quantitative teachers, urban areas might win in most cases. Also, rural districts can have the ability to get more waivers and more flexibility, and I'll mention a couple of programs that provide funding for rural schools and also sort of allow them to provide special incentives for teachers. And so having the ability to bid on the marginal teacher can be very valuable, where in an environment where everybody sort of competes with an average salary schedule for everyone. So you might be really interested in somebody who is very good at computer science, but in order to offer them more money, you have to offer more money to the art teacher, to the physical education teacher, and everyone else on your schedule.
Becky wanted to see those advantages again. I think that was a previous
Yep.
slide.
So these are not necessarily advantages. They're just sort of unique factors in rural areas. So having thin markets is a most definite disadvantage when you're trying to fill positions. Now, low returns to education, if you hold the number of people constant, low returns to education is an advantage because those educated people that you do have in your area there's fewer competition for those individuals from the private sector. Again, holding constant the number of people you have in your economy, this is an advantage, and this can be an advantage.
Okay, she's good.
So non-wage competition becomes very important, right? Again, because you cannot pay the teachers that you want, you cannot pay them more. So teachers, after a certain amount of time, there's lots of evidence in the literature that senior teachers, for example, gravitate towards low minority schools and more affluent schools because they like the working conditions there. So this phenomenon has been studied quite a bit, and it is known to cause disparities in urban areas. So because you cannot pay good teachers more money, then once everyone finds out who the good teachers are, then essentially the only way for those good teachers to be rewarded is through non-wage benefits. And the main non-wage benefit that teachers want is nice working conditions and nice living conditions. So many rural schools have nicer working conditions. They have less crime, they have more social capital, so they provide a better working environment. Now, also, urban and rural areas have very different packages to offer in terms of quality of life in general, and so there is an opportunity for non-metro areas to compete strongly on non-wage competition. And I think to some extent they do. They do focus on creating their own supply of teachers. This is also in part why rural areas tend to favor people who grew up in the community, because those people are more likely to enjoy the non-wage benefits that that particular community has to offer. So that is really a pecuniary sort of pecuniary compensation that these communities can offer to their own that other communities cannot. So the same graph as before for the different kinds of teachers, but now by type of location in Minnesota. Can I? What happens if I go to? I can go to full screen here, right? Okay, there we go.
I think that only affects
That only affects the way that I see it. Okay.
your view.
So
Yep.
so for all teachers here, at least in Minnesota, the cities tend to lose more young people than anyone else, and then suburbs come in second, and then towns and rural areas are about even here in terms of how many teachers they lose within the first few years. These definitions are from the NCS, National Center for Educational Statistics. So if you are curious on how do I define a town and how do I define a rural area, these are the Department of Education's definitions that pertain to school districts. So this is for all teachers in general, right? But as we pointed out, there's really not a problem with all teachers. Problems are more severe with teachers that have trades that pay well in the private sector, like STEM teachers, for example, here. So at least in Minnesota, rural schools actually show a retention advantage over urban schools for STEM teachers. So if you look at this differential here, in all teachers, it's about the same as in STEM teachers. So urban areas have more trouble retaining their young STEM teachers than urban areas do, and then more STEM teachers make it all the way to retirement in rural areas than do in the city. So hardly anyone does in the city here, and suburbs start to look more like rural areas in terms of when retirements happen, or the share of people who make it all the way to retirement. If you look at general ed here in elementary, so I think Minnesota rural districts are fairly secure in terms of their ability to have general education and elementary school teachers. They hardly lose anybody up front, and everyone makes it all the way to retirement. So I would really not worry about, at least in Minnesota, rural schools being able to get general teachers. So foreign language teachers sort of exhibit the same patterns everywhere, and this might even be a community expert type of. This might be a community expert type of issue. So this is what the teacher profession looks like in terms of when people exit. This is what the rest of the professions look like in terms of when people exit. So no matter what you think you're doing in college, right? A lot of people within the first 2 to 3 years figure out that that's not exactly what they wanted, and then they sort of slowly trickle into different careers until hardly anyone ends up retiring doing the same thing that they did the first day out of college. Okay. So the point.
And this
is Minnesota
national
teachers.
data, right?
Yeah. So
From
this is
Minnesota, okay.
this is the population of teachers. The population of this is administrative data on the population of teachers from 1990 until 2014. So in terms of measuring teacher quality, so we talked about there's sort of three ways to observe teachers. There's the signal that we talked about. So a signal, the logic behind this: someone has a master, so they're likely pretty good at this, so they're expected to perform well. The second way is by performing the practice itself. So when the principal goes and observes a teacher's practice in the classroom, that's exactly what they're doing. They're observing how they're conducting their daily jobs. And then the third is pure output. So I don't care about credentials. I don't care how you do it. At the end of the year, I want test scores to have obtained a certain amount of growth. So this is the idea behind these value-added measures. So value-added measures are essentially statistical measures that attribute some growth in standardized test scores from a teacher's own students to exposure to that particular teacher. And so these are used to evaluate the teacher's influence on an average cohort of students. They're pretty popular. They're very easy to compute. They are output-based measures, so a lot of people like them. But they're only applicable to tested subjects and grades. Sometimes they tend to be not very persistent over time, which is a huge problem because you have teachers that look great one year and then next year they're not so good, and then year after they look good again, and so this sort of inconsistency creates problems for using these. And so there's a huge discussion on this, which I'll mostly forego here. There's also concerns with teaching to the test. So some people believe that teachers spend disproportionate amounts of time on technique rather than knowledge. But the bottom line is that they have been found to predict success. So a recent study found that if a group of students was randomly assigned a teacher that performed one standard deviation above the average teacher on these value-added measures, they were a lot more likely to go to college, to finish college, to gain employment quickly. They had higher wages, they had lower teen pregnancies, and so sort of everything that has been associated with a quality education is correlated with randomly being assigned a good teacher in third grade. Because of all these benefits, this number has a fairly large amount of consensus among education economists. So a one standard deviation improvement in these value-added measures for a teacher produces about 400,000 in net returns to society per year per class. And so value-added measures have their problems. There's a lot of debate around them, but they do seem to predict things that we like, and they have irreversibly entered the lives of American educators. They are being legislated into many states and at the federal level, so teachers will have to deal with value-added measures sooner or later, regardless of where they are. There are some multi-measure efforts, like the Gates Foundation MET project. So they add peer observations and student survey data to these value-added measures, and they create composite measures which have additional advantages and disadvantages. So the combination of all three measures sort of weighs advantages and disadvantages, and creates more robust overall measures that can be used for all kinds of decisions.
Becky had a question about the last slide, whether that was dependent on signals. I think the value added is probably looking at the student performance rather than the signals about the teacher.
Yeah. So the value added is the opposite of a signal. The idea behind the signal is, I am Elton, I have a PhD, so you must think that I am great at teaching. This value-added measure is, I go into the classroom, I get my student evaluations, and they look terrible. And so there's a mismatch between a signal and an output. So value-added measures are output. They're entirely output. And quite frankly, signals do a poor job of predicting them. So multi-measured efforts address some of the concerns. So what are the implications? Some of the implications for rural areas, right? So these are nearly unstudied in a rural context. They're actually hardly studied at all because they're so recent. But there's quite a bit of literature just coming out on pay for performance and these new performance measures in teaching. They have not been studied in a rural context. And so one implication is that these are statistical measures which require norming. So basically, I said earlier when I talked about being one standard deviation above the mean, if you don't have a good way to measure the average teacher, these don't really make any sense. And so some states are implementing these statewide, in which case rural districts are just going to get their scoring technology given by the state. But in states that aren't, so Minnesota has not done it until now, for example, almost all of the urban districts are doing it on their own because they're large enough to do it. Rural districts are not doing it. So there's a one-sided blindedness here to where urban districts have the ability to get access to these good measures directly, and rural districts don't have that on their own without a concerted state effort. Because a small district cannot really compute their own value-added measures. They will not make a lot of sense. Also, it would be interesting to see how these peer and student observations work in high social capital areas. So, when you're in a district that employs 20,000 teachers, the evaluator comes in and they sort of observe teachers, and they are able to perhaps score them in a more impersonal manner. In smaller settings, when you're being evaluated by your own students and your own colleagues and peers that you have relationships with, that may or may not work very well. It may work better because there's more knowledge to go around. It may work worse because there's less of an inclination to be blatantly honest. You might fear social consequences. So states are already starting to legislate evaluation based on these measures. So pretty much most of the South has already done it. So Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, Texas have already required that at least a share of a teacher's yearly evaluation come from these output-based measures. Minnesota just passed the legislation last year. This year we have 11 pilot schools that are piloting these new measures, and it is anticipated that starting in the next 2 years, a third of the annual evaluation of each teacher in the state will come strictly from these measures. Also, up until now, we were discussing how recruiting good teachers is sort of difficult, especially in quantitative areas. And poaching is really almost impossible because you cannot bid on individuals. But so far, pre-market signals have sort of been weak. So even if you have the money or if you have the ability to go out and see if you can recruit a good teacher, right? You don't really know what a good teacher is. I mean, I've set multiple times in human resource meetings at the at Minneapolis public schools, right? And so myself, an economist at the business school, and an industrial psychologist whose entire job is sort of designing good hiring interviews and tools. And we've been looking through hundreds and hundreds of resume data for teachers, and we've sort of been trying to pick which ones are going to be good. And we've given them to students, we've given them to other HR professionals to see if they can like look at resumes and credentials and predict who is going to end up being a good teacher. And even the best of us is yet to beat a coin toss. So even if you're trying to poach teachers, you don't know who to poach. Now, once you implement these measures, right, a teacher, once they work 1 or 2 years, they are going to have a report card that shows you exactly how good they are in terms of these measures, in terms of the value-added measures. So that will increase this sort of ability of everyone to poach from each other. And so I think, for instance, high minority areas are not going to fare well with because of this. So if you're a young teacher, you can go to like the worst school that no one really wants to work at. You could show over the first couple of years that you're a very high value added teacher, and then you can pretty much go and get a job at any other school that you want if you get really high scores, right? I'm not really sure how this would affect rural areas. Having these signals readily available, it might make it easier for rural areas to go out and find truly qualified people. It might make it also easier to lose them. So this requires a lot more thinking that neither I or anyone else that I know of has done yet, but it is coming in almost every state, including some in the Midwest. And so Minnesota teachers are going to be poachable in the next 3 to 4 years, and so we don't know what's going to happen in terms of sort of disparities. Also, performance pay, sort of performance-based pay and dismissal. These are there's a huge movement towards tying pay and dismissal to these performance measures. There are the designs on how people do this are very heterogeneous. So there's still the literature on what these do is still sort of developing. So because I think way over already, I'm only going to mention this grantor-grantee format. So what happens here is the central authority says, okay, you propose to me what kind of reform you'd like to make, and I will give you $200 or $300 per pupil per year to implement it. And so school districts sort of propose pay for performance type reforms, and if the central authority likes it, they fund it. If not, they don't. So this is how Race to the Top works. This is how the teacher incentive funds work. The first 2 programs that implemented this type of system were Minnesota's QComp in 2005, and then a program in Texas, I think in 2006, and the one in Texas sort of got interrupted. So what's important about these programs, especially for rural areas, is that these programs allow rural districts to design and propose their own contracts. And so one is able to study how rural districts differ in terms of what they might design. And also it allows rural districts to try and use some of this to gain more flexibility in recruiting teachers. And so I think we'll just skip on to the next slide. So I think in particular, so I've studied Minnesota's QComp, sort of the overall program. We just published a paper on QComp a little bit ago. I still have not looked at the rural-urban differences in contract design, in contract performance, but I intend to get there within the next few months. And so some of the interesting questions are, for example, do group bonuses work better in rural areas? Because the group size in rural areas is sort of naturally limited. And so that's sort of up and coming. So I guess the other big picture problem in rural areas is the problem of money. Because of sparsity, and because there are fewer people, and because school finance is largely through local taxation, there is less overall money, and there's less of an ability to take advantage of economies of scale. So most of the literature has focused on how to use funds more effectively. So things like the 4-day school week, things like either consolidating schools or sharing resources, using technology to deliver low demand classes, etc. These are sort of well-studied methods for using funds more effectively. I've seen less on the dynamics of sort of raising more funds and what this does, right? So research on optimal school size has produced very little consensus, but surprisingly, there's not even a whole lot of consensus on whether giving schools more money would actually improve their performance in terms of student test scores and graduation rates. So the reason why that is a difficult problem to study is because it is very difficult to separate, because funding is such a local affair, it's difficult to separate the amount of funding from the community's ability and desire to support their local school system. So use of local referenda is a very promising tool for trying to separate these things. So referenda, voting in a referendum gives you like a smooth sort of percentage of people who like you and who would like to give you money. But there's a sharp difference between who gets the money and who doesn't. So one could say that a vote of 49% and a vote of 50% are pretty much equally well liked by their populations, but 50% gets money, 49 does not. And so some recent literature has used this discontinuity, this sharp divide on who gets money and who doesn't, to study the effect of schooling, the effect of funding on schools. So they found some positive impacts of school construction projects and investments in capital. Very small positive impacts of operating budget funds. Now, no study has focused on rural schools using these discontinuity type methods, and I think it's important that is done, because the extra dollar in a rural school could actually go further than in an urban school that's sort of already larger. So I did do some preliminary analysis of referendum data from Minnesota. And I'm not going to address the effect of money on school quality, but this is data on about 2,000 ballots from Minnesota since 1990. And I have separated them by locality. So we have urban, suburban, town, and rural areas, right? And here we have the percentage of districts that go to their voters for money. So this is a reflection on how confident the district is that they might get money. Because if they don't think they're going to get it, then they just don't go. It does not make sense to go ask for money when you think you're not going to get it. This is the percentage of ballots that passed. This is the average yes vote on all ballots. So this is for urban areas. This is for suburban areas. So suburban areas go to their voters about a third of the time. They do get it 60% of the time by a slim margin on average. So these numbers are no different, except for this. The remote rural districts go to their voters far, far less. Basically, they go to their voters half the time than suburban districts go to their voters for funding. But when they do pass at about the same rate. So there's really so this might sort of this might be some evidence that these remote rural areas are less willing to invest in local schools. So the other problem that has really not been studied as an overall problem is this connection between community support, ability to get funding, and then having to take drastic measures like consolidating and closing schools, etc. So essentially, I've read lots of anecdotes to where lots of schools went on or school districts would go on the ballot. They would try to get more money, and when that fails, then they have no choice but to consolidate, and so they just sort of try it 1 or 2 years in a row. And if the ballot fails a couple of times, then A, they don't have the budget. B, they get the message from their community that they're just not that important to them, so then they agree to some sort of consolidation deal. I've also heard anecdotes about the opposite, to where voters will say, you know what, we are not going to give you extra money if you do not use it efficiently. So we do not need 2 schools. If we do have, if we have 1 school, then we're more certain that the money is going to good use. And so perceptions of waste by small administrations tend to also hinder the voters' willingness to give local schools money. So there's been no analysis of the relationship between community expression of support through the share voting yes, money going to people through whether the yeses were enough to fund versus not, and history of consolidation. So I'm doing a little bit of that work, and I haven't gone too far yet. So all I have to show you on that is, so these are school consolidations in Minnesota again since 1990. So there have been no consolidations in urban or suburban areas. Some in towns, and then most are in the remote rural areas. So here I separated the percentage of school years that there's a ballot on the table by distance from the next consolidation. So these are all schools that are going to be, these are all districts that will be merged in year 0. And so they go to the ballot very infrequently, 5 years out and 4 years out, and then about 3 years before they consolidate. The share that goes to the ballot doubles immediately. 2 years before they consolidate, the share remains higher than before. And then on the year of consolidation, still more people go to the ballot than 5 or 4 years out. But then once consolidation happens again, on the first year, hardly anyone goes to the ballot. But the consolidated district does start to go to the ballot quite a bit more in the long run than each of the member districts did far before consolidation. So I really do not know what this means at this point. I have to do a lot more thinking about this. So the only thing that I can claim here is that there's something interesting going on here, but there's still some discovery needed. And I think that's mostly what I had to say. I've made my remarks sort of along the way. I guess the two takeaway from a research perspective, the takeaway is that there is already a lot of valuable research in the area of education, and so figuring out how rural areas fit into this body of literature will be valuable. And then flexibility is very important when you're trying to recruit teachers for certain underserved areas. So anything that allows not just finding extra funding, but also finding the mandate to use that funding for incentives for sort of specific types of teachers, it needs to be taken advantage of. So things like the Rural Education Achievement Program and the Small Rural School Grant Program both offer money and some flexibility for using that money for specific teaching assignments. Also partner with nonprofits. So Teach for America, they are the only organization that have successfully predicted teacher performance. Their teachers do very well. Up until recently, they were only in urban areas, but I think 2 years ago, they started a new rural program. And so Teach for America is now looking for rural partners, and they're a great organization to be in touch with in terms of ability to recruit good teachers. And also these evaluation systems are on their way. They're in federal and state legislations. They are unavoidable, and they are already giving urban districts a much better view of differences between teachers. And so these systems need to be implemented early, and rural districts need to sort of familiarize themselves with this, because these are going to be the new normal in terms of human resources.
Well, thanks, Elton. I've pulled up the webinar evaluation so folks could kind of click through that. When you click the box, it will register. You won't see anything on your end. I wanted to ask a question. What about putting in place, has anybody looked at putting in place sort of a lagged bonus system for teachers?
Yeah. So I thought about that some. I saw you had 2 comments on that, and so I don't think I've heard that proposal before, and I think it's pretty interesting. And the answer to what I think about that proposal is a little labor econy, so I refrained from putting it on the presentation, but I'll tell you. So the issue with these value added measures is that they're basically statistics, and so when you attach high stakes to them, you take a $30,000 salary and you turn it into a lottery. And so in order to maintain the same candidate pool, you need to compensate for that risk differential. And so and also there's an inverse insurance arrangement that happens here. The district is risk neutral in terms of money, but the teacher is risk averse in terms of money. And so this is essentially a risk neutral agent forcing a risk averse agent to take this risk. And so the higher the noise to signal ratio is between teacher effort and student outcomes, the less efficient these become. So adding that, so moving these benefits 1 year into the future will have the benefits that you said, but the cost of it is the increased variance. And so the correlation between teachers' current efforts and student success a year from now is weaker than the current relationship. And so it's essentially going to be a matter of whether or not the advantage of moving them forward 1 year justifies this reverse insurance effect that you're causing by inducing uncertainty into wages.
Yeah, I think that's it's an interesting, maybe it's worth an experiment or something like that to see exactly what would happen there.
Yeah.
It would get away from the issues of people kind of gaming the tests, such as was discovered in Chicago.
Oh yeah, Chicago, Atlanta.
Yeah, the Atlanta story too. Becky had another comment here about the impact of maybe giving a bonus at the beginning of the year. That's really interesting.
So I had a piece on NPR when teachers were given a bonus at the beginning of the year. This had a much bigger impact on test scores. So I'm also not familiar with this study. So I think what the idea that they would have went after here is this idea that a lot of teachers are fairly altruistic, and so some people say if you turn this into sort of a hardcore, piece rate kind of market, you might lose whatever you gain from teachers being these altruistic individuals. And so the only thing that's to gain by sort of giving this bonus at the beginning of the year is some sort of reassurance that we appreciate you up front, and so this would sort of be a behavioral effect. And it might work. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. I actually think that that in the short run, um, these non-monetary bonuses might have a lot of power. And also in the short run, I do not expect large incentive pay bonuses to make a huge difference, because we're teachers ourselves, right? So even if I wanted to improve my teaching practice, I don't quite know how. I would have to sort of figure this out over a few years of trial and error before I weigh my practice against my students' evaluations. Um, and so there's that component of it, and also a lot of the gains that people expect from these pay for performance contracts are not by changing the behavior of current teachers, but by changing who wants to become a teacher in the first place. So the people who are teachers now knew full well that they were getting themselves into $30,000 a year, 9-month jobs with relatively sort of low stakes and with a very predictable growth path in their lifetime wages. They're by no means the Wolf of Wall Street type of person. And so by changing the market this way, by making it more of a performance-based market, what people expect to happen is this labor market sorting. They would expect more people who are entrepreneurial, experimental, who don't mind taking risk, and to get into the business of teaching for performance.
Oh, great. Only a couple people filled out the evaluation, so I would appreciate if a couple more people would take a moment to click on those boxes so we can get Elton some feedback. But I think we can turn off the recording as well, so we'll do that.